better if you do.
Hello.
Don't you just love that music?
I know, I can't sit still. I'm like, oh, it's showtime. And then it's so good because producer Adam's like giving us a countdown and it's like, it's coming, it's coming. I know, I love it. I know, it's very exciting. So today we are doing an early St. Patrick's Day show. And just because our show's on Wednesday, St. Patrick's Day's on Monday. And I actually wanted to share my fairy story with you.
That sounds perfect.
Okay. So I had this amazing opportunity, and you're familiar with the Monroe Institute, right?
Of course, we had our Irva conference there, Sci-Fest, just a couple years ago.
That's right. They were awesome. And so I had this amazing opportunity to go there for the Gateway program. And it was, a kind of transitional time in my life. And I went there and I was kind of doing the thing, but I noticed they have these like beds where it has like light deprivation and sound deprivation. So you're like all snug as a bug inside this little kind of bed thing. And so I am not claustrophobic. So to me, this was the most comforting thing in the world. I was just like, so, oh, it was amazing. So you're supposed to go in there to do these exercises 2 times a day. And so slept. I slept 2 times a day and like these big, amazing naps. I wasn't doing what the program was telling us to do. I was just sleeping. And I was feeling horrible about it because I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like a very expensive thing. And I'm wasting all my energy. I'm not whatever. And so I went up to one of the counselors or whatever. And I said, all I'm doing is sleeping. And she said, Michelle, you get what you need. In the right time, you get what you need. And that's probably what you need. So it's not a waste. And I'm like, okay, I'll go with that. And so one of the days, like after we had this talk, I kind of came out of my little nap early and I saw, and keep in mind, these things you can't, there's no light, there's no sound. You have a headphone on, so you can hear the person talking to you, but other than that, nothing. And I looked around, and all I saw was like a little tiny white light, and it was like moving. And I'm like, what is that? And I'm looking all around. I'm looking for a place where the light came from. I'm looking at the headset. There's no light. I'm looking at everything, no light. And I'm like, what is that? And so I kind of went, what is that? And I had this like knowing, and it was like, I'm your fairy. And I was like, I mean, because I'm a skeptical believer, and I was like, yeah, I don't know about this. Did they put something in my food? I don't know. But so then I came out and I talked to my friend and I confided in them because I didn't want people to think I'm crazy. And I said, yeah, this thing happened and it said it was my fairy. And he's like, well, talk to it next time, like have a conversation. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me. It was almost like, in the movies where they have these like real fast flashbacks of your whole life. All of a sudden, I had this huge flashback of my entire life. And I realized that fairies, I didn't even pay attention, were a part of my life, every part of my life, like everything. I used to choreograph musicals, and people would say, hey, how'd you come up with those dances? And I'm like, oh, I have this little fairy that makes up the dances. And then I just dance and things like that. And then, of course, I was into Peter Pan like crazy. I even have sitting on my desk here, I have Tinkerbell sitting here. So all these things, isn't it cute? Yeah. So
Oh, yeah,
she's,
that is so cute.
I
That's
know.
adorable.
I know, I love it. So fairies have, I didn't even put it together, but fairies have been a part of my life. So now from Monroe Institute, I kind of use them as my spirit, guides. And I like if I have something to say, and some of them are naughty, some of them are naughty, some of them are nice, some are helpful, but I engage with them, and it's kind of feels natural for me. So that's my fairy story.
That's so cool. And when you said you were snug as a bug, guess what that reminded me of?
What?
Snug as a bug. When were we at another place where
Right. Ooh, the bugs. Oh my God, the bugs, the bed bugs.
that was like, excuse me, I still have a cough. That was a year before we had the Irva conference at the Omega Institute. And remember, you and I, we were so excited. We had heard for years and years about the legendary Omega Institute. We got there, it was like 10:30 at night or so, and we get to the reception area, and we were there basically before almost anyone else. There were just a couple of people there. And we go to the desk, and first they put us in two separate buildings. Like we were totally alone in these big dorms, but two different dorms were next door to each other. And it's dark out, and we were kind of freaked out. And I remember I went into my room, my bed, and something didn't look quite right. And this was right after COVID too. So they had been kind of shut down, or they were at like a skeleton staff. And I look and I swore I saw these little black things, and I'm like, oh my God, are these bed bugs? Like I've never seen bed bugs before. And then I lifted up the mattress and I saw a couple more. And then you came in and you're like, I'm not going to stay in that big building by myself. So we're like, oh, you can just stay in any of these rooms and we'll let them know we're changing. But then I showed you the bugs, and then we went over to your dorm and looked at your bed, and it was the same thing. And then we weren't positive, and one of the only other people there was Paul Smith. So we
We're
called
knocking on his door in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, and we're like, knock, 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 and we're like so scared. Is he gonna come out like dressed or not?
yeah, we were scared, but fortunately he had his PJs on. And he's of course he's been in the military. For those who don't know him, he's a long time military remote viewer. And we're like, Paul, what do we do? Can you come and take a look? And he was like, yeah, I've seen lots of bed bugs in my life. He didn't exactly explain where, but I figured in the military. So he came over and he had his little magnifying glass or something. And he's like, yeah, those are bed bugs. And so then we grab all our stuff, and we're walking outside, and there's these phones everywhere where you can call if there's an emergency, and we're calling and no one's picking up. And now it's like 2 a.m. and we're just walking around with our luggage. And but the reason I brought up the Omega Institute was I remember once we did get into another dorm, which was fine. It was great. The beds is way nicer. That's where we had that big party, and we got in trouble for having a party.
We always get in trouble.
Yes. So but before that party, the first night I woke up in the morning, and I had this image of these faces of these really creepy little dwarf guys. Like their faces were like bright greenish blue, and they just looked kind of ominous. Like I could tell they were dwarfs, but they looked like dwarfs, or dwarfs or gnomes or something like that. And it was like they were looking at me, and there were a few of them. And after that, there was just like nonstop activity, like at least clairvoyantly, like every time I closed my eyes, when I fell asleep, when I woke up. And it was so funny because the next morning we went to the conference program, and I saw Dale Graff, who, he's so into into dreaming, and he is a very practical guy, even though he's intuitive. But the first thing he says to me is, "Oh my God, what is up with this place? I couldn't get any sleep last night. Like there were like nonstop like beings or some crazy stuff coming to me." And he's someone who, as long as I've known him, he's never talked about spirits, anything esoteric. So I was like, yeah, see, there is something going on here. So, the same thing with Monroe. I was there for a week for a research project, a sleep study. And like you, I pretty much did sleep through all the meditations. But same thing. It was like just nonstop clairvoyant activity, like every single moment. And I thought some of it seems to be from the other people, but some of it definitely seemed to be like entities or kind of weird things. Did you notice anything like that?
No, I was sleeping.
But then another place, where were we in Washington State when we went to John Vivanco's training?
Oh, Eastati Ranch.
Yes, and that was insane. You had a lot of visuals there, didn't you? Like when you were waking up?
Yeah, I lost time there. But we could talk about that next time, but we should bring Morgan on.
Okay.
So, but I'm so excited to talk to her.
Yeah, we have so much more to talk about as far as these topics and weird beings, and she'll be able to help clarify some of this too. Like I'll just share a little bit about her right now. And hi Morgan, it's great to have you here.
I've been enjoying listening to you guys.
You're like, oh, I forgot I'm the guest.
Yeah, we figured we'd bring you in on the conversation, especially because you are the leading expert in fairies and all these different topics related to fairies. We'll be talking about leprechauns and dwarves and
folklore and
yeah, so much. And I could not believe when I looked at your bio, like it said that you had like some books published, but then I went and looked and it looks like you've got 29 books, maybe more than that. That's how on earth do you, like, you don't look that old. Did you start when you were 2 years old?
Well, thank you for that. I've been writing for about 15 years now. And I generally write 3 to 4 books a year because it's what I do. I don't have like a day job. It's just this.
Wow, that's incredible. I would love to do that. Like just write and nothing else, except of course for our Side Chicks show. But that is, I mean, that's a lot of books in 15 years. It is. And that's a testament to what a hard worker you are. And I know also that you've spoken at professional scientific conferences and you've done so many media appearances and you lead workshops in these topics as well. And also you're a blogger, a poet, and a teacher of esoteric subjects. And also I was reading that you were a witch and a priestess. Can you tell us just a little bit about that? I know our audience is going to wonder about that. Are you a good witch or a bad witch?
No, I joke. Everyone out there's getting really nervous now. Yeah, I like to think that I'm on the side of the good guys, if there is such a thing out there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So basically, just a little bit of my background. I grew up in the Irish American diaspora, which is kind of where my interest in fairies comes from. But I was raised without any specific religion. So when I was about 11, a friend of mine had gotten a book on neo-pagan witchcraft, and she wanted to try it, and I kind of got taken along for the ride. She didn't want to do it alone. And then she ended up deciding that Catholicism worked for her, and I ended up deciding that, the idea of a spirituality with a goddess and a god and magic appealed to me. So that's kind of how I ended up going in that direction.
Wow. And do you practice your magic like daily? Like what would you say you do with it?
I mean, I think the spirituality is definitely daily. Just the idea of connecting to, powers that are bigger than us, whether that's fairies or the good folk, a goddess, or sort of that universal power, whatever you want to call it, whatever name you want to put on it, that created everything. That idea of sort of connecting to that. And I like that because I find it very peaceful to sort of take a little time every day to meditate on things that are bigger than me, the universe and the spirits and all of that. Actual magic in the way people generally think of it, like witchcraft and spellcraft and all that, I wouldn't necessarily say I do that every day. More when I feel like there's something that would benefit from it. I do a lot focused on healing and a lot focused on manifesting, better things, better circumstances, all that fun stuff. That's probably the main things that I do.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is it really that much different than other manifesting techniques and visualizing, affirmations, putting it out there what you'd like for yourself or others? Like, is there any difference than other practices like that?
Sure. I think for myself, and I say this because there's as many kinds of witchcraft out there as there are kinds of any other sort of spirituality. So not everyone's gonna do things the same way I do things necessarily. But I think for myself, the sort of magic that I do is more focused on, they would call it sympathetic magic. So if I was doing healing for someone, I would make either a little cloth doll or a little paper doll to represent the person. And I might use a green candle to represent healing, drip a little green wax wherever they need it, the heart, the knees, the head, whatever, and sort of use that to focus and to represent what I'm trying to do. Whereas I know a lot of other manifestation techniques and affirmations, it's more just the focus and the words without necessarily that physical component. I've always been a hands-on person, so I like the physical components.
Yeah, and that's similar in remote viewing, or even in the clairvoyant work that I do. I found a while ago, because I teach visualization practices in clairvoyance, and I found that some students were sometimes really every once in a while they'd get really stuck, or someone would be like, oh, I just can't visualize. So then had them take a piece of paper and draw a person's body and then just touch the body, or scan the body. And that's something we do in remote viewing practices too, is constantly drawing and putting things on paper. So it seems like putting pictures or names or symbols on the paper and touching them is not that much different than taking a doll. I have a friend who she'll take her stuffed bunny rabbit, and when she does a healing, she just says that rabbit is the person, and then she's touching the rabbit, and then she'll just wash it in between.
I use a gingerbread person.
Oh, cool.
Do you mean on paper, or you actually make some gingerbread?
That is funny. Yeah, and then I eat it when I'm done. No, I draw it. But maybe I should make them.
Yeah, then you could eat them. Well, there's a very good book it's something called The Sin Eater. I don't know. Have you read that, Morgan?
I haven't read the specific book, but I'm familiar with the concept. I actually find sin eaters really fascinating.
Can you share a little bit about your knowledge of them?
My understanding of them, again, because I don't know what's in the book, is that it was a practice that you used to find in particular parts, I think, of the UK, where there was this idea that someone could consume another person's sin to sort of take that away from them. And they would sort of travel around and go to different villages, different places. And it had to do, I'm not going to remember exactly because it's been a little while, but it had to do with eating bread. And the person who was trying to get rid of the sin would kind of focus all their sin into it, and then the sin eater would literally eat it and then take it into themselves. And I know there was something special about the people who would do it, who acted as sin eaters, but I'm honestly not remembering what it is. So maybe you remember?
Well, I remember that, basically their healers and their healing method was taking and transmuting all the bad stuff, the illness, the curses, all into their body. And they were seen both as a very necessary function of society, but they were also shunned in many ways too, because they were thought to be kind of like dirty and contaminated. And I've had a couple of experiences. I was at this lecture where these people were like showing a movie, and they said it was like made by this one guy, and the guys, like students, they were like acting as disciples, and they were all saying like how amazing this guy was, and how he they didn't call him a sin eater, but it was the same idea, like that he takes all their illnesses and brings them into his own body. And and I had a little bit before that, I had noticed there was a man sitting in the back of the room, and he looked gray. He looked so sick. It was almost like I could see like bugs crawling on him. And when I had first walked in, I was like, oh, who is this guy? But then I forgot about him. And so meanwhile, there's this program, and these people are going on and on about somebody like sucking in all the energy to themselves. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Are they going to show who this guy is? And suddenly they ask him to stand up, and it's that guy that I saw at the start. And he was so sick, he can like barely walk. And then this one woman who was one of his disciples, she came up to me and she's like, oh, isn't this wonderful that, he's here for us when he can barely walk, but, this is the kind of person he is. And I was like, don't you feel bad for him? And she was like, oh no, this is what he does. And he just gave me a healing yesterday. And I was just like, oh God, I had a lot of judgment on it, because this poor guy, like he really looked like he was suffering big time.
Yep.
Well,
yeah, no, it's fascinating how that stuff works, and the idea that, like you said, they perform this essential service, but then they're also kind of shunned for it. People don't want them around except when they're doing the work.
Well, and isn't that a little bit like with witches as well? Like a lot of people will come to them if they, need a love spell or something like that, but then they're also like fearful of them as well.
I actually thought, I'm sorry, I keep just really quick, because that makes me think of something. If for anyone who's ever seen the movie Practical Magic, it's kind of like how the sisters are in that movie, where like the town doesn't treat them very nicely. Like people kind of pick on them for being witches. But then, when people need like a love spell or healing or whatever, they kind of come to the back door of the house, asking for help. So yeah, definitely a similar dynamic.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Well, what about fairies? Michelle and I were talking about those earlier, and I know you're one of the leading experts in them. And so I was thinking we could start off, because, some people have ideas like just like Michelle said, Peter Pan and just childhood fairy tales. We don't take them very seriously. So why should anyone who's watching this right now take this subject seriously or believe in them? Like, what is the evidence for fairies? And then we could go more into what are they? Because there's also like positive and negative traits that I think would be very helpful to cover. But what's the best evidence?
I think that, when we actually look across sort of all the folklore and all the different places we find them, there's so many stories. There's so many people who've had encounters and had experiences, sometimes in dreams, which I know in the modern times we don't take dreams very seriously, but sometimes like physical encounters when they're awake, and I think when you kind of look at just how many encounters there are out there, how many people have had experiences, how many people have like had these inexplicable things happen, that is kind of evidence itself. There's got to be something going on there for so many people across all these different countries and cultures to have these similar kinds of stories and experiences. When it comes down to like the actual individual encounters, like you said, some of them are positive, some of them are negative. I think that we have a lot more people today that do have these experiences, but don't either want to talk about them because we kind of, as soon as you hear the word fairy, you're assuming like childish and, you know, all of this other stuff, like not respecting it really. And also because we live in a world, as I'm sure you know, because this applies to everything, fairies, ghosts, psychic experience, all of it. Everyone wants a rational explanation. Everyone wants to understand, like in a rational way, how is this happening? And sometimes there's just no current rational explanation for it outside of this is the phenomena, you know, this is fairies or this is ghosts or you know, things like that. And I think if we can stay skeptical but also stay open-minded to the possibilities.
And so how would someone know if they're experiencing a fairy versus a ghost versus maybe like an alien type being? What are some signs that they're dealing with a fairy? And yeah, I'll ask you some questions after that about like some stories that your favorite stories. But yeah, let's start with that.
Sure. I do think that like the whole conversation between fairies and aliens and UFOs is probably a whole separate conversation. We can definitely get to that. Just if I start to get to that now, we're going to spend like 10 minutes just focusing on that. I think some of the biggest ways are fairies can appear very tangible. And that's something people don't talk about as much, particularly here, like in the United States, but you find it in other places, Iceland, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, places like that. There's this idea that like if you encountered a fairy, it wouldn't seem to be insubstantial. It would seem like it was actually physically present with you. People have had experiences where they have interacted with fairies, touched them. You know, I realized how weird that sounded as soon as I said it, but you know what I mean? Like there's a physical reality to them. And
so they see them, they can feel them. Have they described what they look like? Do they look like how we have seen them depicted in art or different?
Yes, no, maybe. Yes. When we talk about fairies, everyone, of course, immediately pictures kind of what Michelle had talked about in her story at the beginning, that sort of like little glowing orb or glowing light or like a very tiny winged kind of being. And that is certainly one possibility. But when we talk about fairies, really, we're talking about this whole range of beings. And that includes the little tiny winged ones. It includes beings that look very human, are not, but you know, I've talked to many people who've had these experiences that say initially they thought it was a human person, and then things happened, and they realized, oh, this is not a human. This is, you know, something that's different. One of the main things people will describe is like they'll appear out of nowhere and then they'll disappear back to nowhere, with sort of no possible explanation for how that's happening. There's also, people can see like fairy hounds, fairy dogs, fairy horses, fairy cats are a whole thing. So it's this actually really wide range of possibilities.
That's so cool. And do they tend to see them more outside than inside, or in certain environments over other environments?
Yeah, I think that probably it's more common for people to encounter them outdoors, sort of to have moments, particularly when they're kind of in the more wilderness places. But I have talked to people who had experiences in cities, in apartment buildings. So it's kind of one of those, like, you're more likely maybe to encounter them in lonelier places and wilderness places, but not only there. They can kind of be wherever they decide they want to be, I think. So lots of options, but definitely more likely when you're out in the wild.
And are the fairies seeming to do anything in particular? Like they have a reputation for being mischievous. Would you say that the stories have confirmed that? Or can you give us some examples of what they do to people or around people?
Sure. I definitely think there are a whole range of them that are more on the sort of mischievous, you know, they're not really going to hurt you, but they're maybe going to mess with you a little bit types of beings. We also have ones that are just helpful. People will talk about having experience where a fairy sort of appears purely to assist with something, particularly healing. A lot of people will talk about. But then we also have a range of fairies that are more maybe dangerous or malicious. So it's definitely a whole spectrum. I think.
Morgan, so when you said healing, that's what the ones that I have, I can see them like, if I'm working on somebody, it's almost like, I don't know if I'm making it up or whatever's going on. It's hard to believe myself, but I see them with, a chisel and a hammer chiseling away bad energy in people's bodies, just kind of working it out that way. And I just kind of put them to work and they go. And we had a question in the chat. We have a few comments. We popped them up on the screen. One said, "Can fairies be summoned?" Was one, yeah.
Yep.
And then a few others.
I wouldn't necessarily recommend it myself, but there's certainly, a tradition of that. There's sort of, so when I'm talking about when I practice witchcraft, I'm talking more low magic, folk magic, sympathetic magic, like we were talking about. There's another type of magic out there. It's called ceremonial or high magic. And it's the very involved, lots of symbols, lots of materials, very specific timings. And people who do ceremonial magic have what are called grimoires, which are kind of like, you might think of a spell book, but it's more like almost a prayer book and a spell book put together. Most of these people were Christian. I just want to put out there before anyone's starting to get a really strange idea. Not like what Hollywood tells you. Right. And we actually have evidence in some of the 17th century ceremonial magic books, which have survived today, of invocations for fairies, summonings for fairies, usually to get them to do a specific thing. So one of the ones that's out there, it's to summon a fairy to help you gain knowledge over, herbal healing, for example. So it's definitely possible to summon them. I try to look at it more like you might want to put out an invitation that they can choose to answer or not, whereas summoning is kind of like demanding that they appear. And I personally try to avoid the demanding end of things.
And why is that? Why would you avoid that?
So, as I mentioned at the beginning, my background is very Irish American diaspora, and in the diaspora and in Ireland as well, there's sort of this idea that you really don't want to offend the good folk, the fairies, because they can cause you a lot of problems if they're upset with you. So you want to try to be polite and be respectful. And I just, for my own approach, I'm like, I wouldn't feel like it was very respectful if someone was demanding that I show up to help them with something. So I personally don't do that, but I think an invitation, then you're leaving it, to them. They do it, they don't do it. You're not demanding anything. Then if they choose to, then you can go from there.
And can you give us examples of some of the problems or havoc that they've wreaked in people's lives, the ones that weren't so nice?
Sure. I will say ahead of this that the way we kind of understand fairies today can be, I should say, very different from how they're traditionally understood. So fairies traditionally were seen as these beings who were like not gods, but sort of in between humans and gods. A lot of the Christian explanation for fairies is that they were a kind of angel that like wasn't good enough for heaven, but wasn't bad enough for hell, and is kind of in the middle. That's fairies. So they can do a lot of things. They can heal you. They can also make you sick. They can give you good luck. They can take your luck away. They can cause positive things, like they can increase your fortune, things like that. But they can also do things like cause you to have mental issues, cause you to get physically sick. And in some stories, they will kill people. So, yeah, it's a pretty wide range, and hence why I try to be respectful.
That's a good advice.
Yeah. So it's definitely a lot of ground that they can cover.
And how do they relate to other beings like gnomes and gnomes or dwarves? Can you talk about that class of spirits?
Sure. So, and this is one of those fun things that like nobody agrees on. Everyone has their own opinion. Scholars or academics, when you read their work, one person's going to say one thing and then another person's going to say something different. So keep that in mind. But generally, things like gnomes and dwarves would sort of fall under that umbrella term of fairy. And sort of, again, like there are people, I guarantee you listening to this already being like, that's not true. But generally, it's sort of looked at as there's this overarching concept, which is fairies. And then you have things within that, like gnomes, like you mentioned, dwarves, sylphs, which are the little Tinkerbell looking ones. It's a lot. And I think because it's such a broad category and it's so not defined, that's why it allows for this sort of, some people put this in here, some people say that that's something separate. Like mermaids are a big argument, whether those should be considered in this grouping of fairies, or whether they're kind of their own separate thing.
Well, and it makes sense that, it's like the animal kingdom, right?
Yeah.
Like you've got ones in the water, ones in the air, on land, and different characteristics, but they all share this same environment.
Exactly. That's actually the analogy I usually make to people, is that when you think of fairies, think of it like you would the concept of animal. If we're talking about animals, you have mice, you have wolves, you have house cats, you have just so many different things that are kind of all in that same group. And it's sort of the same way with fairies. Although within the last 10 or 20 years, there has been kind of another fun disagreement, because, what would a community be if it didn't disagree on everything? Where people are starting to use the term fae as that catch-all term, and then fairy more specifically for like the Tinkerbell kind of things. And again, that's something people love to argue over. So I use them interchangeably.
Michelle, you had something you wanted
to raise my hand? I'm raising my hand. So I wanted to ask, because I was talking to a friend of mine about this very subject, and we were talking about the elementals and that kind of, I don't know, how to categorize it, but that they live in a different plane and they sort of pop in and pop out. Is there anything about how you would explain how they just kind of show up and, they're not easily defined, like Bigfoot or, any of these other things? Are they aliens? Are they just beings from other planes? Like, because we do talk about different dimensions and multiverse and all sorts of things. I know I'm getting into weird territory, but let's do it. Let's do it.
That's where the fun is. So it's fine. Yeah. So there's two sort of things behind that they appear and disappear. On the one hand, and just to get this out of the way, there is an idea that these beings can influence human perception, human senses. So they can kind of have us see what they want us to see, touch, feel, scent, like it's a full experience, sensory experience, but they can kind of influence that. So we have a ton of stories where a human interacts with the good folk, the fairies, and for example, thinks that they've been brought into this house that's just this great mansion and, rich everything everywhere, and it's amazing, and they're so impressed. And then something happens that causes the enchantment to break, and there's different things and different stories, but something happens where the human then can sort of perceive the truth, the reality, and realize that no, they're actually like in a cave. They're not in a house at all. Everything that they're seeing is sort of an illusion. It's not actually what's around them. So there is this idea that fairies can pass invisibly around humans because of this. If they don't want to be seen, then they're not going to be seen. They're going to be all around us, and we're not going to know they're there. This is one of the reasons in places like Ireland, there's a big emphasis on being respectful when you talk about them, because you never know when there could be fairies around. The other thing, though, which is kind of what you were just getting into with the other dimensions, other planes, is part of what makes a fairy, specifically a fairy and not some other kind of phenomena, is the idea that they come from their own world, their own reality, the world of fairy, and that they have this ability to move back and forth between their world and this world, sort of as they choose. Humans don't have that ability. We can't just decide we're going to be in their reality and then back in this one, but fairies can. They can kind of step between dimensions. There is a huge argument that's been going on for at least 5 or 6 years now about what exactly that world is, whether it is another dimension, whether it's another type of reality that we just can't perceive, that is around us all the time, but we can't access it. Some people believe they're interdimensional or extra-dimensional beings, so that they exist in a dimension that is kind of layered into our dimension. It can get very esoteric if we keep going down this road. And then, of course, there is sort of the discussion of whether they are possibly what, different corners, different demographics would refer to as aliens. And that's a whole continuous debate between the sort of the fairy folklore community and then the ufologist community.
Well, and it's so tough because isn't it possible that different cultures are viewing this phenomena through particular lenses? So it could be UFOs, but people are seeing everything through the lens of fairies. And then it could be fairies, but everyone's seen it through the lens of UFOs or aliens. So
and that's exactly the two arguments. The ufologists will say, this is aliens, it's always been aliens and UFOs, but humans didn't have a concept for that until 140-ish years ago. So they explained it as fairies, and that fairies are just sort of the way that aliens were understood without any modern technology around. And then the fairy folklore community people will argue the exact other side of that coin, that what we now call aliens and UFO experience and alien abductions are actually fairies, but that as we've become very technological and as we've had particularly science fiction as a genre sort of come around, people who don't have any context for fairies, who don't understand what fairies are or believe in them anymore, but they do know what aliens are and what alien technology potentially would be. So then we have fairies now getting explained instead as aliens. And the same evidence that supports one argument supports the other, because it's just looking at it from the opposite side.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's where intuitives like clairvoyance and remote viewers, we have like the best shot because we'll tune into a lot of different spirits and we can feel the difference, or they'll have slightly different appearances, but they feel kind of different. And so I think that's where intuitives that are intentionally going after, whether they may have spontaneous experiences of these beings and multiple ones, and then they may also like do remote viewing sessions on them. I don't know if I know of any remote viewers that have like tuned into targets as fairies, but I think that would be great. There's a lot that are like tuning into um, what would seem more so like UAPs or aliens. And I think it would be really great if we tasked remote viewers to like 1 week aliens, or another week fairies, another week um, uh, gnomes or dwarves, and then can the remote viewers tell a difference between them?
I think you really hit the nail on the head a little while ago when you were talking about the context and the way different cultures or different groups understand a thing. Because I do think a lot of it comes down to perspective. I've watched a lot of like paranormal shows, like ghost hunting shows, and they'll be, having an experience and they'll be going through all of what's happening. And I'll be sitting there on the other side of the TV going, that's fairies. Those are fairies, not ghosts. But because they're going into it looking for ghosts, they're looking for hauntings, that's their context. So they're not seeing it the way that I'm seeing it, where I'm like, it's doing this and it's doing that, and it's, not acting like a ghost normally would because it's fairies. So yeah, I think that perspective, yeah, exactly on the screen right now, fairies. I think that perspective really is important for how we understand these things, And I don't think there's anyone that's right or wrong in any of this. I think we're all trying to understand what's going on as best we can.
And there's so much going on. That's probably the thing. It's just there's so much activity everywhere from so many different sources. Well, that brings us to Michelle. You might want to ask this about the black-eyed children. You were talking about that earlier before the show.
Well, yeah, are they fairies?
I love black-eyed children folklore. It really fascinates me. And I think from my perspective, I would certainly argue that they're probably fairies. And there's a couple reasons for that. And I know that there's many other views out there. And I've even heard people argue that they're like vampiric. I've heard people argue that they're ghosts, that they're aliens, generic cryptids, like all sorts of things. But this is just my personal understanding of it. They tend to appear wearing outdated clothes. And that's actually a really big thing with fairies. The more human-looking fairies, one of the things that sort of initially will clue people in is they're usually dressed in clothing that is like a generation or two out of date. It's not what you would see people wearing today, but it's something you would have seen people wearing maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So the fact that the black-eyed children are usually said to also be that way, the idea that they often sort of appear out of nowhere, and people have described like when they leave that they'll sort of also disappear. That's another big thing we see with fairies. The way that they tend in a lot of stories to approach people who are alone, which is, again, not all fairies. Like we do have group encounters with fairies, but it's pretty common in stories for someone to be out alone. And even the idea that they'll come to people's houses and sort of knock on the door and be asking for help, sort of trying to trick the person. That lines up with some fairy folklore as well. So I think that they check off enough, marks on the fairy identification list that I would be comfortable saying that they fit into that category.
Wow. And for people who aren't familiar with the Black-Eyed Children story, it sounds a little cruel. Like, okay, a kid comes to your house, they're asking for help. Like, why wouldn't you help them? Or what is it about these particular children that have made people feel like afraid of them? Can you tell like a couple of stories about that?
Sure. Well, and I was going to say, you just mentioned another check mark on the fairy identification list, which is you just get a very unnerved feeling around them. Even though there's no like they're not doing anything threatening or weird or hostile, but there's just something about them that makes you feel anxious, or there's something uncanny.
Well, they're creepy. They're like they say like their eyes are like they're black and you can see through them, and it's just like very creepy.
Yeah, very pale, dark eyes, well, black eyes. Yeah. And just the situation they show up in, the idea that you're just at home, you're by yourself, and all of a sudden there's this knock on your door, and it's, this child or children asking for help, but they won't really give you details, because that's all the Black-Eyed Children stories I've ever heard or read. That's one of the features, is they'll ask for help, but if you ask them like, what's going on, where's your mother, what help, do you want me to call the police, they won't answer. They'll just kind of keep saying, help me, let me in, help me.
Like they want to come in your house, but they won't say why.
Right. And it's that sort of like, they won't answer directly, and they have this creepy aura to them. And there's always, the stories that I've read, there's always a feeling by the person in the house that if they go out, something terrible is going to happen. That like they're afraid, even though, like you said, it's children.
Has anyone ever let them inside their house?
I am trying to remember. I know that there's one story where the person did open the door. Usually they get the descriptions because the person will look out the window and say, like, I can see these, creepy looking children. There's one person who opened the door and I think didn't invite them in, but was sort of asking them, what's going on? Why do you want to come in? And they wouldn't answer. And the person got a little freaked out because they weren't just coming in on their own. It was like they wanted to be invited. And they eventually closed the door because they, just got too freaked out. And I think we're trying to rationalize, like, maybe this is kids playing a prank. I
was going to say, it sounds like Michelle and I when we were teenagers and we were playing Ding Dong Ditch.
Yeah. Yeah, but with black eyes.
Yeah, Morgan, with all your research that you've done and personal experiences and everything, what has surprised you the most?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit of a personal story, which surprised me, although it's not going to surprise you because this is kind of in line with the experience you had. But so coming from the background I come from, there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that those little Tinkerbell fairies don't exist. Everything else is real, but not those. This is what people say. I'm not saying that myself. I'm just putting it out there. This idea that, the idea that they're tiny and winged is kind of coming from Peter Pan and coming from modern art. So I kind of had this attitude about it when I was younger of like, oh, no, those aren't a thing. And then one evening, I was with a friend of mine who owns a store, and it's sort of a local little like esoteric witchcraft metaphysical kind of store, candles, incense, all that. And there was a third friend with us, and it was summer. It was getting dark, so it was pretty late at night, like 9:30. We'd open the front door of the store because we were just hanging out. I was in my early 20s, and this is what you did back then if you didn't like going to the club. You just hung out in metaphysical stores and enjoyed the night. And we were just kind of talking about kind of nothing in particular. And all of a sudden, this gigantic like double palm sized, initially thought it was a white moth, flew in, and it was huge. We don't have large moths around here like that. We don't have bats that are that big around here. And we all three of us kind of stopped and looked up at it. And it was just hovering in air, which I don't think moths can even physically do, above the doorway. And the person who owns the store just saw it as a moth. But the other friend and I both very distinctly saw a little man with these white moth wings. And he just kind of looked at us, and we just kind of looked at him. And then my friend who owned the store was like, well, we have to get it out. It can't be in here. And it flew over to the side where there's like a big picture window and then like a little display. And the other friend who was with us just points at it and goes, "You," really loud, which is hilarious in retrospect. Because at the moment I'm like, I don't know what to do. I'm like 21. I don't know how to get this out of here. And as soon as he said it and pointed, it stopped in midair and then it just fell straight down.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So all three of us go over to look in this display, and it was just gone. It was completely gone. And it was physically impossible. There was nowhere for it to go. And it was not small. It was not the sort of thing that could have just like slipped into something and disappeared. Like, it was very large. And it was just completely not there anymore. And it surprised me, also taught me a lesson to keep an open mind.
Right.
To not get an attitude about like, well, that particular kind of thing isn't real because I've decided it isn't, even though there's lots of stories about it.
Yeah.
You get that kind of attitude and then you're going to see one.
You're right.
Well, and also that teaches us that you can like protect yourself, or you could set your boundaries and say, hey, go away. Like, we're not okay with you being here. And that has an effect. It sounds like it had a big effect.
It was definitely effective that night. It just gone. Yeah. So I think.
Do you find that like in other stories you've heard that like when people tell these beings, get out of here, I don't want to deal with you, that they do tend to respond?
It depends on the being. A lot of them seem to, like, in the same way that a human, if you were like, I don't like you, I don't want you around here, they'd be like, well, I don't like you either, and I'm leaving. It does seem to be a lot of that, and especially the physically smaller things seem to be a little more resonant with that kind of thing. I want to tell two really quick stories. I'd seen a comment early in the chat about someone saying the only type of fairy experience they had was with sleep paralysis. And that can be a fairy thing. I've only ever once had sleep paralysis, and I do believe it was something supernatural. There's a term for it. They're called mayors or Marin. That's where the term nightmare originally comes from. And I was very tired, and I woke up and I couldn't move. And there was just this really oppressive feeling of fear. Like, really, like, you're completely terrified and you can't move, and you're awake and you're kind of aware that you're awake. But at the time I had a toddler and I was really tired. So after like the initial moment of this is what's happening, this is what's going on, and this sense of like presence there with me, I got really mad because I'm like, I don't have time for this. I have a kid that's going to get me up soon. Like, I don't have time for this supernatural nonsense that's happening right now. And I kind of channeled that anger and was just like, you need to leave because I don't have time for this. And it instantly did. It immediately like went away, which cracks me up now because I look back at it, I'm like, I don't know where I found the nerve to be like, you need to get your terrifying supernatural butt out of my house. But parents of toddlers will understand. So yeah, that happened. But on the other hand, my same friend who owns that store, she's from Pennsylvania originally, and she had an experience where she was in a park at night and started hearing weird music, and there's this very strong sense of like something not good. And it freaked her out enough that she started running, and then she could hear someone chasing her, Like she hear the footsteps behind her, and she just had this overwhelming feeling like if this catches me, I'm done. And she managed to get out of that wooded area she was in and into a different area of the park. And she said as soon as she got out of the trees, it stopped. The weird music stopped. The feeling of being chased stopped. And I don't think that was the kind of thing that you could get an attitude with and have it listen to you.
Yeah.
Something, that was something more like predatory.
Wow. Those are really good stories. Yeah, I oftentimes will be out like in the woods, or we're surrounded by forest here. And even like we just walk over the bridge and start walking down the road that you have to take to get out of here. And it's so beautiful right along the river, and I'll feel really great. And then all of a sudden I'll just start getting like such a creeped out feeling. And I'll run back home. And I never know, like, is this just being paranoid? Because I can't ever say like what I'm really afraid of. It's just like I suddenly start to get like more and more scared and then terrified. And I guess in those moments I'm not, if I'm in my bedroom and I'm seeing a weird face or voice or something, I'll do what you did, like with your, not wanting to be bothered, like, come on, I'm too busy for this. But yeah, it's different when you're outside, and having that feeling like you're being watched or something's about to pounce if you don't get out of there. But it's hard to tell if you're just paranoid or not.
Yeah, I've always kind of encouraged people to trust your instinct. I think if you feel very uncomfortable somewhere and like you're not supposed to be there, or like something's dangerous, it's always better to just trust that. Than to try to push through in case there really is something that doesn't want you there.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a relationship between fairies and Bigfoot, or you've probably come across a lot of Sasquatch stories in your explorations?
Yeah, I'm kind of neutral on that one. I have a friend, Joshua Cutchin. He's written a couple books really getting into like the comparison between aliens and fairies and Sasquatch in particular. And there's a lot of similarities with, across the board with all of this folklore. I personally, because I don't live in an area that has Bigfoot or Sasquatch or any version of it, I don't think I feel as connected to the concept, if that makes sense. I can only look at like other people's theories on the subject. I personally do think that there's enough overlap that it's really interesting. And if someone told me, who's very familiar with this and has experienced it and studied Sasquatch and Bigfoot in particular, and was like, this is a kind of fairy, this is something that fits into that category, I would agree with them, but I do think it's such a genre of its own, really, that I would hesitate to say something too definitive myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. So, Michelle, do you see any questions in the chat?
Yeah, I see one that has Morgan ever watched True Blood, and are there it is, half human, half fairies a thing in traditional fairy folklore?
So I haven't actually watched the show, but I read the books.
Oh,
the show is based on.
Okay, yeah.
I know the show is a little different from the books because they always are, but the half fairy thing, I do understand that reference from the book series.
I will say, I don't know if the books were probably hotter than the show, right? They're pretty hot.
No, I've heard a lot about the show, so
it's pretty hot. Yeah.
Oh, I love that show. That was good.
I'm sure you did.
Yeah, when it first came on, I had small children, so it wasn't something I really could watch very much. I probably should watch it now, just because I did enjoy the books quite a bit. And as to the half human, half fairies a thing in traditional folklore, they very much are. There's quite a lot of stories about that concept. Fairies and humans getting together, particularly the more obviously human-like fairies, and then children being produced from that. I actually have a book coming out the end of next month called Paid with a Kiss, which is just about that subject. It's basically like sex and love in fairy belief and how all that works. And it's surprisingly common across everywhere that believes in these beings. They have these stories.
And have people reported like having sexual encounters with fairies in the same way that, you know, I've talked to a lot of people over the years that felt like they were basically like molested by some kind of spirit. But, you know, a lot of people found it to be a very disturbing experience, and others, you know, maybe just confusing for them. But yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. That is out there. The disturbing or uncomfortable, questionable consent stories are actually less common with fairies. Usually it's more seduced and voluntarily engaging in the activities. But it's really widespread. There's a term for it in Irish, Lonanshi, which means fairy lover, fairy sweetheart. If that tells you like how common it was. There's a whole term for it.
Yeah.
Stories with selkies, which some people do think are fairies, some people don't, to be clear. But one of the main themes with selkies is the selkie bride, the selkie woman who marries a human man and then has children with him and then eventually leaves and returns to the sea. So yeah, it's definitely a pretty common idea. I think it's probably not something that surprised me necessarily, but I think the thing that surprises the most people who are interested in fairies is finding that out. But actually, yes, this is a big thing, and it's supposed to be fairly common.
Wow.
Yeah, there's whole Irish families that claim they have an ancestor who's a fairy. Like,
and it's more often that the fairy is female and the human is male, or is it equally divided?
Probably slightly more common in the stories that way. The stories that we have with the reverse, it's usually the human woman gets taken out of this world and into the world of fairy. Whereas the other way, when it's the human man, it's usually the fairy woman is in this world for some period of time. And then the children usually, but not always, stay here, as opposed to when it's a human woman, she's taken into the world of fairy, usually. And then any children she has would be there in that world. So that's probably the biggest difference between the two.
And I have a personal question. I thought it was cool that your name was Morgan, because what isn't Morgan supposed to be like the queen of
Morgan Le Fay and Welsh folklore. It's really funny though, to kind of wrap this up a little on a humorous note. So yes, my name, a lot of people assume has to do with that, the Morgan Le Fay and the fairies, and obviously that's a main interest in my life. My parents, or my mother in particular, I should say, chose the name Morgan because it's a breed of horse. And she's a big horse person, and she really liked the Morgan horse. I know this sounds so ridiculous, but I swear it's a true story. And because she liked the breed of horse so much, she decided that was a great name for her oldest child.
Well, that's really cool. If you have to be named after something, why not horses? And just that you would then go on to write about fairies so extensively. That's really, really cool.
It's definitely a funny coincidence for sure.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe if your name wasn't that, you would have never gotten into the subject matter. Like, you just never know what you were destined to do. Well, yeah, Michelle, do you have any final questions? It looks like we're at our time.
I mean, I have more on other things, but yeah, we have to have Morgan come back and like dive deeper, into like other things. Like, she's got vast 30 books, like over 30 books or something. I don't know. So it's a lot, and it's great. And
what is your favorite topic to talk about, like out of all your books? Is there like one that has subject matter in it that you like to talk about it the most?
That's a tough one. I just had a book come out last September on Celtic fairies in North America. And that's always a really fun subject to get into because people don't realize how much folklore there is in North America, in the US and Canada kind of in particular, but also the US and even Mexico. So that's always a good one.
Are there particular states in the US where there's more fairy activity than other states?
Generally speaking, New England and Appalachia. So sort of that eastern seaboard kind of area. We tend to find them most, but not exclusively. I mean, you do find them in other places, but probably the most would be kind of through that area.
And I guess it's kind of hard to say, is that because like the settlers, like the people from Ireland settled there, or maybe people are attracted to there? What do you think it is about those areas?
So I did hear a really interesting theory because apparently before the continents split, the mountain range that it goes across the eastern seaboard, the Appalachian Mountains, basically, actually used to be joined with Ireland and Scotland and England. It used to be just a continuous place, and then it split, obviously, over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, whatever it was. And now it's two separate continents. So there's an ocean between them. But I do sometimes wonder if, because it was originally one landmass, if maybe that's part of why we see the most stories kind of in that same, what would have been that same area.
Wow, that's really wild. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's kind of neat to think about, I think.
Yeah. Oh my God. Well, Morgan, thank you so much. Yeah. It was so great to have you on, and I hope you have a great St. Patrick's Day coming up. And I know in Chicago we turn the river green, so
Boston does something similar, I think.
Yeah.
Do you really? You really do? Like with
so. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if they literally turn the river green or if it's just lights or how they do it, but Boston goes hard on St. Patrick's Day.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah. Well, I made 2 corned beef briskets and cabbage yesterday in celebration.
Wow.
Nice.
That's awesome. We're coming over.
I wish you could. I would love that.
That'd be fun.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
We did too.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye. Oh my gosh, that was so cool.
I know there's so much there, and now we have even more reading to do, about 30 more books on top of all the books from our last show with that I hope people will still check out the recording from, with Ellie Flippin and with her book and all of the books she published for Ingo. It's like every week we acquire dozens more books that we're going to now have to check out.
I know, it's great. So, well, enjoy. I hope you enjoy. What the Cherokee in North Carolina have Little People Legends. That's what Nancy's.
That would be cool to hear about.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to check in with her.
Some people have seen them in modern times. That's cool. Wow.
Very cool.
There's so much going on that we don't see all the time. So it's really.
Yeah. And, I kind of wonder, like with all these different beings, like, we're always trying to classify them because that's what we do in our culture, is try to label and classify so we can understand and categorize. But I wonder, do they have names themselves for what they are? Like maybe they don't even have names, they just are themselves, and then we're overlying the names on them.
Yeah, we put human concepts on things that are not. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we have to go deeper dive on all this stuff. It's so cool. I love it.
No, and I love these little animations that are producer God Adam is putting up
Dear
there.
God, Adam. They're
Love it.
so cute. I know. We are so thank you, Adam, because he
you.
does such a great show. So we should thank him. And then anyone still here listening, we please, tell your friends about our show. And I think our next one will be the Wednesday, not next week, the week after. And always, like, if you want to email us and tell us some suggestions of shows that you'd like. I mean, we have tons of ideas, but we want to bring on people that you would be very, very interested in. So we would welcome your suggestions anytime. So, and good luck, everyone. Manifest good things this week. And I know there's a full moon and an eclipse and all that fun stuff going on
Don't
Thursday,
drink too much.
Friday. What?
Don't drink too much.
Yeah, don't drink and drive. Yeah, that's good. All right, guys. Well, have a good one, everyone. All right,
Bye.
we're signing off. Bye.